आंसर सर।
शंकर सर के लिए सर नेक्स्ट
इसके बाद
नेक्स्ट नेक्स्ट वाला तो हमारा 2 पेपर है और 1 घंटे बाद।
1 घंटे ठीक है, तो स्टार्ट करा।
मकवाना से स्टूडेंट्स खड़े होंगे ना, बाहर भेज दीजिए प्लीज़। हाँ, 3-4 भेज दीजिए।
Do you want any help to set it up with her?
No, I'm not. I will
So
do.
just try getting her on Skype
Okay.
first. I guess that will be important.
Okay, she will not be available on Skype. She will do it on Blackboard Collaborate.
Okay, yeah. So it's better because if we can set it up.
Yes, yes, yes. 3-4 आ जाओ स्टूडेंट्स और अभी ये वाला लगा दो जुडित मैम का वहाँ पे। या जस्ट आई जस्ट हैव सीन इट।
Anyway, I've WhatsApped her to say that we're contacting her.
यस मैम, यस मैम। She has sent the presentation also. वो दोनों को बोल दो स्नेहा और इसके लिए registration.
No, no, she's the one because she used to put the Savada plan into action. She can't be at work. No, no, sorry, after. So they're expecting full change, that's good. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, I'm good. You and Chandra Kumar are going to tell me, Chandrasekhar is going to tell me about your experience during the 5 day session.
Thank you to the organising committee for inviting me to present this paper. My name is Judy Rogers. I'm sure you are having some rewarding discussions, and I hope this presentation will make a contribution. I'll begin with my slides to ensure all will run smoothly, and I will turn to the screen.
Hello ma'am. Hello ma'am. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good. Where should we put this?
Ma'am, please mail the PPT because
Should I mail it?
we are not allowed to
Okay.
put the pen drives.
So this is basically professional development.
कोई फाइल में देना, वो सर के ऑफिस में रखे हैं।
चार ले आओ।
Because ultimately the role of education is to make changes. Nothing to change in the ground. Right? Otherwise what's the point? Okay, please start when you're ready to start.
Yes.
Is Judy coming online or you using her voiceover?
She has sent the collaborate PPT and the voiceover.
Okay.
Both.
So you're using the, so
Yes.
which one are you using? Sorry?
Collaborate voiceover
Voiceover?
with the presentation.
So you don't need her on Skype.
No, she will not be available on Skype.
She is available on Skype.
She told that she will do it by collaborate. Otherwise, if we need it for the discussion, we will take her on Skype.
Okay, so I'll let her know because she's on standby.
Okay.
So I'll let her know not to bother we're using the voiceover.
Yes. Can she come after like half an hour for discussion?
Okay.
So shall we start?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. So our first session will be today by Judy Rogers. It is on education. Judy Rogers is a senior lecturer and program manager of the Master of Disaster Design and Development in the School of Architecture and Design, RMIT University, Melbourne. She has a track record in and strong commitment to urban sustainability and community engagement. She has been responsible for the development and delivery of innovative circulation in sustainability and community partnerships and for leading and mentoring staff to deliver the curriculum. She has presented papers at a number of major international sustainability conferences and has written extensively on urban sustainability and sustainability education. Qualifications include a PhD focusing on sustainable city policy and a Master of Environmental Science. Okay, so we will play her session on Collaborate.
Thank you to the organising committee for inviting me to present this paper. My name is Judy Rogers. I'm sure you are having some rewarding discussions, and I hope this presentation will make a contribution. I'll begin with my slides to ensure all will run smoothly, and I will turn to the screen at the end of the presentation. I begin my presentation with the observation that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development has as its ambition no less than transforming the world, which leads to the question, how do we educate students to transform the world? This presentation therefore has as its starting point that sustainability is not a thing or an endpoint, but rather a way of thinking, talking, writing and acting in response to the identified need for transformation and for change. Before I begin my discussion about education for sustainability, I would like to share, however, why I am not there with you today. It does have a direct bearing on the presentation that follows. As I've been preparing this presentation, an unprecedented series of conditions are unfolding across Australia. In the last 2 months, since September 2019, fires have been burning across 5 states of the country with varying levels of intensity and of loss. As of the 9th of December 2019, 2.9 million hectares has been burned in 2 states, Queensland and New South Wales alone, with more to come. Described in the media not only as unprecedented and catastrophic, the fires in one state alone, New South Wales, are referred to as a mega fire that is largely uncontrollable and, according to the Bureau of Meteorology, too big to put out. According to the Climate Council of Australia, these conditions are not normal and can be directly attributed to climate change. In Australia, as elsewhere, the fire season has significantly extended. Temperatures are the hottest on record and rainfall low. Even more concerning is that December is only just the beginning of summer, with the hottest weather and greatest fire danger periods still to come. We, the Australian community, need to prepare for what has been described elsewhere as the new normal. Incremental measures that simply reduce unsustainability are no longer enough. Areas of Australia that have never burnt are now burning due to an ongoing 8-year drought in Queensland and New South Wales. And those areas include wet, subtropical or warm temperate rainforests. Wildlife has also been badly affected, with estimates of at least 2,000 koala deaths in New South Wales, Queensland and South Australia. The fires have also shrouded... before I begin there, this is actually a forest fire danger index for the current situation in Australia. So the very dark red areas have an incredibly high fire danger, and as you can see, a huge amount of the continent is affected. So the fires have also shrouded the capital city of New South Wales, Sydney, in smoke for days on end, and the air quality index has reached as high as 11 times hazardous level December 2019. Health warnings to residents have been ongoing and have led to a protest involving thousands on Wednesday, the 11th of December. The event was titled "New South Wales is Burning, Sydney is Choking, Climate Emergency Rally." The smoke haze across the city has led to smoke alarms being activated and buildings evacuated. The situation unfolding in Australia, however, is not without precedent. Wildfires in California, Spain, Greece, amongst other countries, have stretched the available resources globally, and with fire seasons overlapping in the northern and southern hemispheres, emergency services are raising alarm bells regarding resource sharing. As the situation was unfolding, I calculated my carbon footprint and decided that the 2.75 tonnes of carbon for an economy class return flight was too much. What this brief story also demonstrates is that the future is now largely unknown and unpredictable in a post-climate change world, and that new ways of thinking and acting are needed to confront the changes now unfolding globally. We need to refer back to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development to transform the world. Or, as Escobar has put it, we need to prepare for an altogether different world. So what does this mean for education for sustainable development? Returning once again to the 2030 Agenda, in reading the document, some significant keywords emerge. These are justice, inclusion, equity, empowerment, resilience, participation, which all suggest the following question: what does a just, inclusive, equitable, empowering, resilient, and participatory education look like? I'm not sure I can fully answer this question in this presentation, and given the current focus in tertiary education in Australia, at least, on educating students in preparation for industry, there are many challenges, so it is a work in progress. In fact, likens the process to a snakes and ladders game, where while progress is often made, we are also aware of the snakes or slippery slopes that mean we often have to take several steps back before we can reposition ourselves to progress in the right direction. The argument here, however, is that beyond transmitting content about sustainability, spaces also need to be made in our curriculum that reflects the core values of inclusion, justice, equity, resilience, participation. These are things that cannot be taught as content. They need to be demonstrated through the way we approach our teaching. As Sterling argues, the role and purpose of education can no longer be preparation for an assumed stable future and business as usual, but a nurturing of individual and collective potential to live well and skillfully in an already complex and volatile world towards human and planetary betterment. Sustainability education, understood in this way, needs to actively involve learners in their own education, requiring a shift away from content-based approaches to one of process-based participatory learning, where students are encouraged to develop their own potential, to imagine a different future. The result is to teach less about and more for and through sustainability. Transforming the world also suggests that spaces need to be made for students to imagine what has not yet been imagined. Or as Davis and Samara have put it, what teaching is can never be reduced to or understood in terms of what the teacher does or intends. Rather, teaching must be understood in terms of its complex contribution to new, as yet unimaginable collective possibilities. Educating students in this way provides spaces for them to ask the what-if question, rather than focusing on what is currently known and what in many cases causes a great deal of anxiety. This anxiety is very real for many of the students I teach, and they have often told me that courses they have taken on climate change or on sustainability often leave them feeling depressed and hopeless. And so, as Spoff reminds us, the challenge is in balanced necessity of creating a feeling of agency and hope with the inevitability of overwhelming despair in the face of global threats. So what does this education look like? I'll now talk very briefly about some examples where this type of education has been attempted by myself, working with some of my colleagues. Both are from undergraduate design studios. The first studio was titled Beyond Anticipation, Designing Climate Futures. The studio had as its overarching theme climate adaptation, or confronting and productively working with the uncertainty of climate change in the urban context. It was a graduating studio for 10 students from the Bachelor of Design and Architecture and Bachelor of Urban and Regional Planning that are on my team. And just to locate where the studio took place, it's right down here in the very south of Australia. So the site chosen was the city of Glenorchy in the south of Tasmania, a local government area that covers several northern suburbs of Greater Hobart. The city spans the western bank of the Derwent River, which is its main waterway. Several creeks and rivulets flow from Mount Wellington into the Derwent River. So here in this drawing by one of the students, you can see the green areas are Mount Wellington, the urban areas are the orangey pink, and there is the Derwent River, so you can actually see the rivulets running from the mountain down into the river. During the studio, we spent a week on site, and from the outset, the students were asked to set aside as far as possible their preconceptions and prejudgments in order to connect with their individual experiences of the urban landscape through walking and observing. The first 2 days were in fact spent walking alone, recording observations in the landscape. In order to do so, students were also asked to look beyond the obvious and set aside familiar approaches in order to develop their own idea of the place. They were also asked to consider how to move beyond precaution towards an approach that imagined and creatively embraced uncertain futures. Key questions addressed in the studio included: how can communities improvise and adapt to continuous change and uncertainty? How can we move beyond projection or geographies of anticipation towards an approach to the future that engages with and harnesses uncertainty and continuous change? The openness of these questions allowed students to explore the not yet imaginable, and the role of the teacher was to provide a space in which this could occur. I'll use two examples of students' work to demonstrate how they were able to work with this uncertainty and to consider alternative possibilities for the place. So Caitlin Zeke's project Toned began with developing an understanding of the relationship between vegetation, soil, water, topography and fire, to consider treatments for the entire ecosystem instead of focusing on just infrastructure, which is what we do mostly now. So fire breaks, firewalls, water bombing, etc. But understanding the various forest types and how they respond differently to fire, it became apparent that wet forests retain moisture and have a lower frequency of fire, while dry forests encourage fire but are susceptible to increased erosion and therefore loss of nutrients. And here you can see the very beautiful drawings of that process where the fire leads to loss of vegetation, which then leads to erosion and loss of nutrients in the soil. As a consequence of climate change, it is predicted that fires will occur more frequently and result in a lack of healthy vegetation. To address these vulnerabilities, the proposed strategy was to use raised berms to reduce the extent of erosion, to gradually sculpt the topography, encouraging ash, seed and nutrients to settle rather than being washed away down. This will allow fire vulnerable dry forests to regain their strength. And as a side effect, these berms were designed for mountain bikes to enjoy the forest without impacting on the delicate ecosystem. Another student tested 3 key strategies for the Derwent River: retreat, fortify or adapt. So here we have 3 strategies or scenarios for the future of the Derwent River. The top one, fortifying, so the use of seawalls to hold back the water. The second one, retreat, so moving away from the shoreline. And the final one, using treatments to actually allow adaptation around the waterway. The second example I'll look at briefly focuses on Port Phillip Bay. So going back to the map, Port Phillip is located here on the south, in the south of the mainland of Australia. The studio was titled Bayside Blueprint, and it was part of a larger project that aimed to investigate climate adaptation strategies for Bayside municipalities in Melbourne, and to develop adaptive strategies for 10 municipal hotspots by working with local government and key stakeholders. Hotspots were identified, so this is the first part of the process, by working with local government and key stakeholders. Hotspots were identified as areas where the physical and ecological effects of climate change were considered likely to have an impact. And the challenge for the studio was to identify and then communicate risks and opportunities in a way that did not increase vulnerability and took into account the existing socio-political and ecological context. So here we have the process where the hotspots were defined, then students researched the site and identified key attributes. We then identified scenarios for the future, so moderate climate change, extreme climate change, based on representative concentration pathways. We then identified 2 adaptation strategies, ideal adaptation and limited adaptation. So on the bottom, you can see the 4 scenarios that we actually developed and worked with. The students also, working with community representatives, identified design values, so values that were really important for the community that would drive the design outcome. By 2070, the Bay will experience a projected sea level rise of 50 centimetres, more frequent extreme weather events and increased erosion. In addition, projections suggest the Bay will be subjected to increasing acidification and warming. Following Evans and Allen, we adopted these 4 scenarios to investigate possible futures. And using the 4 scenarios, students were asked to investigate combinations of these scenarios in their response and to consider what would extreme climate change, limited adaptation, or moderate climate change, ideal adaptation look like. They also considered the risks and the opportunities that could emerge by 2070 and the role of designing, identifying and communicating these risks and opportunities so that communities can imagine a future in the face of a changing climate. Here are examples from one student's work for moderate climate change and limited adaptation, where the student fortified the coastline using breakwaters and seawalls to reduce the impact of inundation. In the second example, extreme climate change and ideal adaptation, the foreshore is allowed to flood and settlement has retreated. Access to the foreshore, however, was seen as an important design strategy, and so the student reimagined what settlement would look like in 2070. And here we have an image, a proposition for floating houses or barge houses. So by way of conclusion, transforming the world requires more than simply transmitting content about sustainability. While this is of course important, it often leads to incrementalism or simply reducing unsustainability. Education for sustainability, I have argued, also needs to reflect principles of justice, inclusion, equity, empowerment, resilience, participation. It also needs to provide a space for students to begin to imagine what has not yet been imagined. So thank you once again for inviting me, and I hope my presentation will make some contribution to the discussions later. Thank you.
So now we will start with the paper presentation. Our first paper for this session is Bridging the Gap Between Industry and Academia, The Case of Indonesia by Usha Iyer Raniga and Tony Delton, and the presenter is Usha ma'am. It's a PDF file.
I think you can hear me. Do I need to use the microphone? Do I have to use a microphone? Looks like like I don't have a choice. Okay, so based on what Judy has just spoken, I think it would be part of, take a step back, and part of the issues that we face, I suppose, as educators. And part of the challenge that we face as educators, I suppose, is on the one hand, we deal with undergraduate students who really need to have a very strong foundation in relation to sustainability, regardless of which, and I'm talking from a built environment perspective here, but regardless of which built environment profession we're looking at, whether that's building, whether that's quantity surveying, whether that's architecture, whether that's engineering, and different types of engineering from structural, civil, mechanical, that strong foundation on sustainability is really, really important because of, and again going to Judy's presentation, the current challenges that we're facing today. So we have moved, in the basket of sustainability issues now is not just about preserving for the sake of the planet and taking that very, I now call the old thinking of sustainability, which is only thinking in terms of the limitations of the planet, but to move beyond that now into what are the current challenges. And climate change is a current challenge that we need to start thinking about now as well. So I've just heard, I've been exchanging WhatsApp with Judy this morning, and for some of you I've already mentioned it, but it's a 43-degree day in Melbourne today, and actually it was a good thing that Judy didn't come because she had booked her tickets to come, and when the fire started in New South Wales and Queensland, she was really torn because on the one hand, she has been committed to come here and do a keynote here, but on the other hand, she lives in a property which is about 40 kilometers from the central business district. She lives in a bush setting, so it's bushland all around her. She's got animals, she's got horses, and it's not just humans that you have to be concerned about, but it's also the animals. And so she made a decision about 10 days ago that she will not come. So we had to end up canceling her tickets, etc., etc. And then she made this presentation with voiceover. And she's exchanged, as I said before, we have exchanged WhatsApp messages this morning. She's on standby. So there's already spot fires where she is. They've already reached up to 42 degrees temperature in Melbourne. And there's a cool change expected, but she's now on standby. And we go through what is called as a survival mode for bushfire preparedness. So she's already now kicking that bushfire survival mode to move the animals into a cooler area, and if required, she's going to have to just leave the animals and just get out of there. And that's a reality that we're facing. So it is within this context, and here we are showing you, or Judy has shown you, the situation in the Australian context, but in some respects, it's actually worse in the Pacific Islands. And I'm singling out the Pacific Islands because most of the Pacific Islands are poor. They don't have money. So if they have no home, if they have these islands are all sinking, if they have no home, where are they going to go? Countries like Australia will survive because we're a rich country. We'll get money from somewhere. People will survive. Houses would get built. Of course, you can never get your own home back, and you cannot get those memories back of things that you may have lost. But people will survive. But the real big issue is what happens to some of the Pacific Islands. And we are actually doing some work in the Solomon Islands and in Fiji at the moment, looking at some of these very issues, both from a climate change perspective, from an adaptation perspective, but also from a resilience perspective. But this work is really looking at, the one that I'm presenting now, is really looking at that foundational knowledge of sustainability that we feel is really, really important to bring in from an undergraduate perspective and embedded into the curriculum from an undergraduate perspective. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of the background to this project. And while I'm focusing this particular presentation on Indonesia, there were several universities across the region that were involved. And what was the premise that we started with? What did we find? And where do we go from here? So the background to this is that, and again, referring to some of the points that Judy made, we are in a climate now where, on the one hand, we are having to deal with mitigation issues. So that's about efficiency of our resource use and reducing the impact that we are having on the planet. But on the other hand, we are also having to deal with change, climate change. And we have to be very careful, particularly as designers and people working in the built environment, because if you only think about if you only think about mitigation, you could actually end up having maladaptive responses from a climate change perspective. And a good example of this is flooding. So if you think about an architectural or a design response to flooding would be to elevate. Now, if you're thinking about it from a mitigation perspective, you might actually want to reduce that elevation, the columns or other things that you might put to move it away from the ground, and try and reduce that from a mitigation perspective so that the actual volume of materials that are being used in the building of the house or whatever that structure might be would be less. But if you only look at mitigation, you're actually ending up with a maladaptive response and having to rebuild again. So these are some of the challenges that I think the current young professionals would have to face. So B here stands for built environment. So we are having all these multiple roles of having to engage. So on the one hand, we have to think about mitigation and adaptation responses together, but we're also working with a range of the built environment professionals, and therefore we have to start thinking about the language that we use when you're engaging with these professionals. So it's also the need to think from an interdisciplinary perspective. So the question that I've put up in red was really where we started. So how can environmentally sustainable or ecologically sustainable development be integrated programmatically into higher education institutions as part of the professional education for built environment professionals in the Asia-Pacific region? And just again, one slide just to remind ourselves that, of course, the litmus test, as I said yesterday, of how cities are performing and where we are heading is all around the need to build. So we are constantly needing to build because that's a great source of income, and that's about GDP, performance of GDP. But on the other hand, we are also having to start thinking about urbanization. And again, cities, particularly in the Asia Pacific, are undergoing rapid urbanization. If you look at the cities that are going to be at the top levels of population in 2050 would be cities like Dhaka in Bangladesh, the cities of China, Philippines, and of course cities here in India as well. So that rapid urbanization is obviously putting pressure from a range of different perspectives, including resource efficiency. So if you look at the total volume or proportion of the impact of urbanization, then about 40% is as a result of urbanization alone. And that includes a whole range of things from power supply, water issues, as well as, of course, the built form itself. So that was the premise of our starting point, is how do we, on the one hand, start looking at integrating sustainability education so that the graduates that come out of various built environment programs are able to contend with the current challenges of our time. But at the same time, how do we start engaging with the professionals? Because the professionals are those people who are already out in the industry post-graduation. And unlike, in the humanities, a lot of the graduates who work in the built environment space, many of them actually don't come back to get a postgraduate education. Most people actually end up in the world of work, and rightly so. After a 5-year architectural degree, who wants to come back to study again in a university? People want to be out there and work and clearly start making some money as well. So we need to start thinking about that. We need to start thinking about the current professionals and the challenges they're facing and what are the things that they're coming up with. And then we're continuously, if we don't change the way we produce our graduates, we're continuously going to be having this gap. And this gap is going to get bigger and bigger as we're starting to deal with all our environmental issues from the industry perspective. So we looked at what is happening in 5 countries.
We looked at China, and Tongji University from China were involved. We looked at Thailand, and we looked at actually 2 professions in Thailand. We looked at architects as well as engineers. The lead university there was the Asia Institute of Technology. In the Philippines, we looked at urban planners, led by University of the Philippines. Sri Lanka, we looked at civil engineers, and Perdinya University was involved in that. And in Indonesia, we looked at the architecture profession, and the University of Gajah Mada was a partner in the process. So RMIT, so Tony and I, we looked closely at what was happening with the architecture profession in Indonesia, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. So what we found that there's a big divide between the regulation of a range of different things to do with the built environment and what is currently happening in the country. And I'll go through each of these. So from a regulatory perspective, the rules and regulations govern the profession itself on the one hand. So what makes a professional? So certain requirements for that person to become a built environment professional. And on the other hand, looking at what is happening in terms of the building energy codes, in terms of the government rules and policies and other regulatory impacts. And this is also muddied a little bit with what's happening with ASEAN. So ASEAN, as you know, are 10 countries that are in a certain part of the Southeast Asian region, including Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, etc. Because Singapore tends to be the country with big shoulders in the region and has been quite advanced, a lot of the Singaporean architects are actually moving across the border. And because they're very slick with what they do, they're actually taking jobs away from the local architectural companies, whether that be in Indonesia or in Cambodia or in Laos. And this is a big issue as well, because these countries then are not relying on their own architectural knowledge to respond to built environment issues, but what they're getting is a cut and paste of the type of design that you would see in the Singapore context into these countries. So effectively, you're promoting the use of glass and steel, which is used a lot in Singapore, rather than looking at indigenous responses in terms of design within these other countries in the region. And this is a big issue, a very big issue. So the flavor of what you might see cities in the ASEAN region is actually now being overtaken by what you would see in the Singaporean context. This is one of the findings that came out of our research. The other thing, of course, that we see is that again, because Singapore is seen to be the big brother within the 10 countries of the ASEAN region, again, what is happening in Singapore in terms of education is also being replicated into the Indonesian context. And while, of course, there are great things, there are good things that can be taken across, there are also some other things that are not so good that are being brought across. And one of that is what I've spoken before about the type of design, the response to the design. So if you look at what is happening in terms of the country itself, unlike the engineering profession, the architecture profession in Indonesia is not self-accredited. And this is a big problem. So while the industry and the Institute of Architects in Indonesia is looking at how they might regulate the profession, unlike the engineering profession, and the engineering profession, if you're not aware, across the world is governed by what is called as a Washington Accord. So every institute of engineer and every undergraduate engineering program, by default, if they have been accredited by the Institution of Engineers, by default follows a Washington Accord. That is not the case in the case of architecture. In the case of architecture, we are governed by what is called as a Union of International Architects, but that is not actually, it's not a mandatory program, and so it's not actually necessarily compliant in other parts of the world. So herein lies a big problem that needs to be resolved. So the other problem, of course, is that Indonesia as a country is made up of a number of different islands. And so the concentration of the architecture universities and programs tends to be in and around the main island of Java. So if you're looking at far-flung regions of the country, you don't necessarily have an architecture program. in that particular university. If you do, that architecture program is actually not recognized by the Institution of Architects in Indonesia. And the third problem is that nobody actually goes there to check to see what is actually happening in those schools. So the concentration of the architecture profession itself tends to be in Jakarta, with about 15,000 architects in Jakarta itself, and not much happening in other parts of the country. So herein is another problem. So the profession, as one recognizes what a profession is, which is about codes, ethics, testing, and ensuring that you have all the requisite technical knowledge to enter into the profession, has problems. The identity of the profession, unlike the engineering, has got problems. And so there are also factions within the profession itself that are not coming to an agreement on what it is to be an architect in Indonesia, and that is a problem as well. Part of this is as a result of the education itself, but part of this is that expectation of somebody who's been in practice for 30 or 40 years. What is it that they feel? So the profession is sitting quite disjointed away from what's happening in the teaching part of the curriculum. And there's another issue, and that is that Indonesia was colonized by the Dutch. So a lot of the, and as is the case here in India, where the architecture curriculum has been very closely aligned with the British curriculum and a legacy of the British colonial rule in India, the same thing has happened in Indonesia. So it's in fact been the Dutch system of education that has set the country up after independence in the country itself, in Indonesia itself. So there's issues there as well. And then of course, the government, various government departments and various government programs, particularly related to architecture, such as planning, such as housing, those government departments are not necessarily having people that are robust in terms of their professional competence. So there lies a problem in there again. And these people are overworked and they don't have the time. So who are the people that are actually ensuring that planning permits are granted? Are people who have been working in the government, and they're not necessarily also checking the drawings and making sure. So therein there is a disconnect there as well. And when you look at the curriculum itself as to what is being taught as part of Indonesian architecture, there is this, as I said before, about the ASEAN issue. And then, of course, within Indonesia, as we have in India, different parts of the country shaped by different types of architecture. It's not uniform and it's not prevalent across the country. So for instance, if you go to Bali, you can see the really strong influence of Indian architecture in Indonesia, whereas of course Indonesia, being a Muslim country, is largely dominated by what comes out of Muslim architecture. So there's a problem there as well. Generally speaking, the higher education is left in the hands of the teachers. So there's nothing from the university end that says that this is a certain level of expectation. What we see in the Indonesian universities are more to do with whether the graduates of the program are able, it's sort of very quantitatively based. So they will look at the number of students that come into the program, the number of students that graduate out of the program, and they check to see how many of these students are employed. But they don't actually check to see what elements of the curriculum that they have taught in the university is actually being practiced in the profession. So how are we going to know whether the technical knowledge that is being taught in the curriculum is actually supporting the needs of the industry? There's no way to do that unless and until some longitudinal research or some checking is done of what's taking place in the industry. So none of that is actually happening in reality. And of course, the quality assurance mechanisms that are there in the universities are all focusing again on the teaching and learning aspects and not really related to the graduate attributes of the students and how these graduate attributes are being tested and shown in the world of work, so in the professional competence of the individuals. Then when you look at what is happening in the universities itself, you find that there are about 159 schools of architecture across the country. And as I said before, many of these are in the far-flung regions of Indonesia as well. So you don't actually have much knowledge about what's taking place in the beyond the main centers of Jakarta or Makassar or even Bandung. So it's sort of sitting within these three main cities. 16 of the 159 universities or programs of architecture have got postgraduate education. And the postgraduate education can be in anything. So you could have it in ESD, you could have it in structures, you could have it in history, you could have it in design. So again, the point being that the postgraduate education is looking at what is happening if you look at the ESD programs after the students have already graduated. And from my thinking, that's already too late because their design knowledge has already been shaped. What really needs to happen is that the core curriculum has got to embrace ESD thinking and practices. And 6 of those have got PhD programs. So again, not too many PhD opportunities available to influence back into the undergraduate curriculum. And again, out of the 159, only 128 undergraduate programs are accredited. And of course, as I've already talked before, there are global recognition issues as well, and particularly the ASEAN, with the Singaporean architects coming in. So there are voluntary schemes, but of course, voluntary schemes don't necessarily determine that this would happen in practice. So the competence is not actually necessarily determined in practice. If you look at the university departments themselves, most of the architecture programs have got very senior professors of architecture, some of who are actually practicing in the industry as part of the mentoring people in the universities. And therein lies a problem. Because if you've got an individual, a tenure track professor, who is not able to give his 100% or her 100% time in the department itself, in the teaching curriculum and student welfare, but is also able to spend part of their time in the practice of architecture, you've got a problem there. And that is rife in the Indonesian context. In terms of innovation in the curriculum itself, that has to be led by the people that are teaching, the teaching staff, but it also has got to be led by the senior professionals in the university through the teaching and learning people, whether that might be vice chancellors or pro-vice chancellors or whoever that might be. And that disconnect also exists currently. So this has created problems. So in other words, 50 or 100 years, and we found this actually in China and in Sri Lanka and in Thailand as well, where the curriculum is nothing has changed. Over the last 50, 100 years, people finish, and those graduates come back, they start teaching. The next level of graduates come back, they start teaching. In terms of the resources that are used, it's the same textbooks that they used when they were students. And those textbooks are continued to be used even when they've been teaching for about 20 or 30 years. So nothing has changed. So how can there be any new innovative thinking brought into the curriculum if even the textbooks are the same as that was being used from 50 or 100 years ago? So I'll just move on to what we found. So this is what led us to, well, how do we then start looking at bridging this gap? So on the one hand, we've got curriculum problems. On the other hand, we know what is happening in the universities, and we know that when these graduates come out into the practice, they're suddenly being, because of whether it's a green building movement across the world, whether it's because of ASEAN architects coming down from Singapore, what is it that they can do to try and change the nature of the profession from the professional end? So what we thought we would do was actually bring the university academics, bring some government people, and people working in the industry together, and that's what we did. So we ran a full-day workshop, and we had a facilitated session throughout the workshop. And what we did in the process was we looked at it from 3 main perspectives. At the start of the day, what we looked at was who are the stakeholders that need to be engaged in order to bring about changes into the curriculum. So who are these built environment professionals that need to be involved in shaping up the curriculum? What are the current opportunities that this provides as a result of engagement with the stakeholders? But what are the constraints? So through our desktop research, we sort of knew what these constraints were, but it didn't make sense for two people from Australia to come and tell them what the constraints are. We wanted them to realize what their own constraints are, so that way they will recognize what their limitations are and start thinking about the ways to deal with it. In the second round of the workshops, we then started looking at what might be the solutions. So what are those bridges that need to be connected between academics, between the stakeholders, and between the industry professionals, including government opportunities? And what actions need to be taken, and what is realistic? What is it that, the participants, the 40 participants that were involved in the workshop, what is it that they can do as soon as they leave the workshop? So what is a short term, what is medium term, and what is something that they look at in the longer term? And what are these possibilities for actions, including engagements with each other in the process? So what did we found? So as a result of the first round of workshops, looking at those opportunities and constraints and what needs to be done, we found that there was absolutely no engagement with the building owners. So some of the iconic buildings in Jakarta, people knew who owned them, but in terms of facility management of those buildings, particularly around things like energy efficiency and around water efficiency, there would be a lot of things that could be done. So that was an immediate thing that people could take away as a result of the workshop. We also found that while we had some ministries involved, we had, for instance, the Ministry of Planning and the Ministry of Housing and the Ministry of Infrastructure, but other ministries such as the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Higher Education, Ministry of Manpower, they could also be involved in the process. We also found that while we had representation from the architectural profession, we actually didn't have much engagement from the planning profession. We had some engineers in the room and engagement from the engineering profession. So clearly they needed to be involved in the discussions as well. We also found that while there were lots of NGOs that were there and that are working in this space, we also felt that we needed to bring in other civil societies into, for instance, there's an organization called BISA, the Building Industry Sustainability Alliance organization. So we needed to bring them into the picture as well. So while we had the end of chain in terms of the industry participants, we actually did not have any supply chain people in the industry. So they needed to come in, and other industry experts, so particular experts working on maybe in the solar space, people working in the water space, they also needed to be part of the process, as well as other contractor organizations, because we did not have any of this contracting. We had the major contracting organizations, but none of the subcontracting organizations in the room. So they also clearly needed to be part of the process. So what were some of those opportunities that were identified? Was better access to global knowledge. So this was really about trying to understand what is a benchmark, or what are those best practices that are happening in other parts of the world. So if we know what are those best practices happening in other parts of the world, then it becomes an onus back onto the Indonesians to see what are those stretch targets and try to access some of those stretch targets. The development of a local curriculum. So really to try and bring people together to start thinking about what is our local curriculum, rather than sort of inheriting this curriculum from the times of the Dutch colonial days. Looking at who are the stakeholders, how do we start engaging with them in terms of the development of curricula, and then start looking at collaboration, not just between the universities in Indonesia, but also across the ASEAN borders, as well as other universities outside those borders. Looking at best practices, so better engagement between the university professionals themselves to look at things that succeeded, look at things that failed, and to help each other in the learning process. And then also start looking at bringing in some of those professional practices into the classroom. I'm not going to go through all the constraints here, but just a couple of them. So firstly was lack of a green building code. So that was one of the first things that were identified. Bringing in the building code and looking at how might you start ensuring that there's compliance in terms of the building code. So putting the pressure back on to ensure that the graduates that come out of the programs are going to be better prepared. And also outdated standards. So looking at how might these be revised and these might be supported. And so the International Finance Corporation, which actually hosted our workshop, was supportive of helping out the Indonesian people in the process of particularly around the standards. And range of other things that I'm not going to go into. And then in round two, where we asked them about, well, what are those bridges? What were those things that we could do? Clearly identifying learning outcomes. So what are these courses currently achieving in terms of their learning outcomes? And are they meeting the needs of the industry? We also looked at how can we bring in more professional thinking into the classroom. So maybe use more of guest lecturing wherever possible into the classroom, and that engagement with what's happening in practice. Start looking at partnerships between the industry, between the government, and between academia as well. Started also looking at the capacity building of the academics themselves, because if the academics know, they can then pass that knowledge on to the students. Awareness and support of green buildings as a whole, and this again needs to come from the core of the curriculum itself. And then looking at round three. So one of the things that was identified was a need to find funding agencies and resources that is going to help them in this journey. And this is where the International Finance Corporation stepped in and said they would help with supporting some of this. And the other important thing that came out was a knowledge platform. So how do they start engaging with each other, and how do they create this knowledge platform? And of course, when a group of people get together, they start talking about what might be some of those wonderful things that you could do from an IT perspective, but sometimes that can create problems as well, because you need to have a lot of information if you're setting up these platforms. So even simple professional development seminars or professional engagement seminars would be a great place to start. So in terms of going back to the question, so the question was, how can ecologically sustainable development be programmatically engaged into the higher education programs as far as built environment professionals are considered? So the first thing that came out of this is capacity building. Capacity building across the board for academics, for industry, for students, and for the university staff themselves. Setting up a knowledge sharing platform so everybody can learn from each other, and setting up a community of practice, and aligning government and industry with academia in terms of curriculum development. So it really doesn't make sense if academia themselves are looking at curriculum development if those graduates that leave the program eventually don't actually understand what is happening in the industry. So that tripartite arrangement between getting government involvement, getting industry engagement, and shaping the curriculum needs to all happen at the same time. So this is where I'll leave you with the paper. Thank you.
I request second author Suzanne Ang, Norvina Mohammad Nawawi, and Rama Devi Nandini to present their paper. So on behalf of them, and the title of the presentation is How a Little Design Project Means a Lot to a Community, Lessons Learned from the Power of Partnerships in Ajarkar, Karnataka, India. Okay, you have changed the presentation. This one? There are two presentations. How a little, okay, this one. Oh, you have two papers?
Is it 19 or 20?
19.
No, 19 is evaluation.
And this one?
Is it this one?
This one. Right now we have How a Little Design, this one. I think that is in another session, right? Yeah. Okay.
When is this required?
If you need.
I don't think so. Let's see. If it's required, we can always. Good morning, everyone. I thank all the organizers for giving me this opportunity. And This my paper is co-authored along with Susan from Deakin and Norvina from IIU in Malaysia. And this paper is basically, I would just like to brief a little bit, saying how a little design project. Yeah, you're not able to hear? Yeah. Yeah, can you hear? I'm audible? Yeah? Yeah. It's audible now? Yeah, before I just go into this paper, I would just like to tell you that this is an outcome of the IDE, that is Intercultural Dialogue Through Design, which we had hosted in Manipal in 2018. That was a collaborative international design workshop, and in that workshop we had worked on Anganwadis, designing of Anganwadis with 3 universities coming together. And here we are looking at how the students from all the 3 universities coming from a different culture, how could they understand the community, the rural community people, and whatever designs they gave and they shared with them, how the students actually felt the importance of giving that design to the community, and how the community perceived it. And we are also looking at the reflections of the students in this after the 3-week program. Is the thing? Where's the next? Yeah, thanks. So this is the flow of the presentation. I'll just introduce as to why we took up this project and what led us to do this project. And we speak about the Sustainable Built Environment Education Platform, about IDD program, and engagement with Anganwadi community stakeholders in the design workshop, and the reflection upon lessons learned in the discussion and conclusion. So this paper basically explored an immersive collaborative learning program for the architecture students through IDIDE, which involved community stakeholder engagement and co-design consultation methods in the design of a new purpose designed Anganwadi Center in Ajarkad, Udupi, Karnataka. So there are 3 things. One is where we explored, and second one where we reflected upon whatever lessons were learned from the experience of the power of partnerships. That is, and all these programs have been happening in the Asian region. And the third one is, this also offered IDD an innovative pedagogical model that leverages of the power of partnerships and collaboration to enliven the social conscience of the society in sustaining the world through the concept of architecture and environment for humanity. So, yeah, this is the basic sustainable built environment education platform. This is the IDD program, and this is the these are the IDD model of collaborative design and education. So this shows actually the IDD cultural dialogue. What are the key elements of this? That is the industry, that is the learning, the ideas, value and experience. And basically this has 3 pedagogical phases comprising of, we have a pre-design research and fieldwork, design and fieldwork, and post-design reflection. That is, before we start this IDD program, We are, we start almost about 6 months or much ahead of it, and then we just take it to see, because all the projects we do under IDD are social outreach, and we try to answer the rural community in the Asian region, and so it starts much earlier, and the three phases are the pre-design, research and fieldwork, where we see who are the partners, and then we exchange the ideas and we exchange the curriculum, the programs, what has to be done in those 3 weeks, and these programs are also credited. And then we have the design and field work which happens within those 3 weeks, and then we have the post design reflection where the students talk about what they have learned, and some of those things which we can see, we have just tried to put in a few, where we see that the students are overwhelmed by what they actually learn, which they would have never seen, because they come from different places, and what they see, the some of the basic amenities are also not there where the things are being designed. And these Anganwadis are mother and child care center, and you must be knowing, because this Anganwadis were proposed by ICDS, that is Integrated Child Development Scheme, which started in 1975. And still there are many rural areas in India where there is a need for these Anganwadis. This is engagement with Anganwadi community stakeholders in the workshop, and here this is where we are trying to show what exactly actually one of the professor from Manipal University said that design gets its value from culture, acceptance through collaboration, and purpose through contribution. So these three dimensions become soul for architecture through the process of dialogue. So this is something that which we have added in the process of this collaborative program whenever we get to meet and we discuss. So these three dimensions we have tried to include, and the challenges what the students and the mentors who are involved in this program, what they are facing is, that is they are, because when you want to go and speak to the community, they have to establish this early rapport and strong dialogues with the government stakeholders. Now, why with the government stakeholders? Because all these Anganwadis are government projects, and they're all for the poor people, the economically weaker section. And so we have to talk to the local governments, to the central government, and these are some of the challenges. And we have to incorporate their input and suggestions in the design to satisfy their needs and aspirations. At the same time, meet the government policy and recommended guidelines for provisioning of Anganwadi. Because this government, the central government has got its own regulations, and then when it percolates to the rural areas and other local governments, they have their own setup. And the central government says that, okay, you can build the Anganwadis within so much of funds. And then when it again comes down to the local governments, they say that you have only these many funds. And ultimately what is happening, what we have realized is, when we actually go and speak to the community, we are not actually looking at what the community wants. We are not trying to fulfill their needs and their aspirations. So they are all living based on, they're all living in such spaces based on what the government wants. And as soon as the government changes, some local people change and the central people change. So because of that, that built environment is also changing, and which the people are not actually having what they want. So we have tried to see, and we have seen that at least the students are try to reflect whether they have understood that. This is engagement with Anganwadi community stakeholders in the design workshop. Actually, these constraints, what I spoke earlier, they presented an unprecedented challenge to the students unique in IDD learning process as its point of difference in authentic learning environments, as that this is never ever presented in a traditional classroom or design studio situation. This is very true, because from the practical experience what I've seen, because Manipal has been a part almost from the past 3 years now, and we are also going to Malaysia in January, where we'll be designing something else. And the best part is we've had at least 2 consecutive years where we have designed 2 Anganwadis, both in Karnataka. One is in Udupi Ajarkad, which I'm presenting now, and the other one we have done in Shirtadi, and it's the same. One is Udupi district and another is Mangalore district. Okay, there was a slight difference. So we have tried to see like what exactly are the constraints and whether the students are able to understand, because we have a series of design charrettes right from the beginning till the end. So the students are trying to find out what are their needs, and then they're trying to go and put it across to them after they design. So it happens once, and then again after they finish those changes, again we go for a third time and tell them this is what we have tried to incorporate. And many of the questions what we got from the community was, people are coming and asking us, but nothing is being implemented and we are not seeing it. But actually there are a lot of problems, and that is what we have realized, which I'll be presenting in another paper next time. And uh, because we have kept this thing very brief, so finally what we did is, what happens in IDD is, when we have that 3-week program, we have a schedule which we give every day's program, what they exactly have to do, when they have to go and visit the community, when they have that community engagement. And apart from that, we also have some cultural immersion. That is because we have students from different countries and different cultures, and to make them understand the place and get used to the place. So all these are the process of learning. And once they finish all this, we also tell the students in the beginning to write down what they are learning every day, and so they come out with their reflections. So here in 2 of the slides, we've just tried to put up the reflections what the students have said. That is one from Deakin University, but the paper has got a few more reflections, one from Deakin and one from Mahe, that is Manipal University. So this is one of the students says, IDD has brought with it an emotional connection to the creation of architecture, centering on the dimensions of collaboration, culture and contribution. She said the need for sense in design and emotional connection to design is required more than ever as we look to the future of built environment. I now know before we ask others to believe in our designs, we must first believe in them ourselves. I think this is very true. That is what they learned. And actually, if you, if somebody had experienced that, we had a couple of workshops where the students conducted for the small kids, because Anganwadis are for children from 2 to 6 years. It is all the basic education before they go to the school. So basically in Anganwadis, the aim of Anganwadi is to see that the children, they get that little bit of learning experience, self-determination or creativity. So we try to see that. But what we observed was the children are so talented, because these students had some workshops for them, like some toy making and painting workshops and all. And the small children had become very close to them, and you could see that they were able to paint, or they were able to, do some sort of this thing, craft work and things like that. So this is where they should have that emotional connect before they want to design any built environment. I think that emotional connect is missing in the curriculum, and I don't think that can be taught. It can be only experienced. So I think this as a pedagogy platform, I think as a built environment education platform, IDD is trying to bring about such things. This what we got to know is from the reflections what the students have written. And another Mahi student has said that it gave me a welcome of departure from my usual curriculum. Because usual curriculum is, you submit, you work, you submit, things like that, and they're all pressed up for time. And it made me realize how much of an impact architecture can bring to the daily life of the Anganwadi people when the right design principles are applied. IDD broke the circuit of an otherwise routine program of the study. It helped me remind myself of the reason I chose architecture in the first place, to make a social contribution. And actually the students are working, they were working much more than their regular time, but we never felt that they really, said that they had to struggle so much for working. But when you see the regular curriculum, no, they always have to say that, oh, can we get a postponement for the submission? Or can we not do this? Can we skip something? But here it was not like that. I'm sure that some of the students are here. I can see them smiling. Yeah. Okay. Now, these are upon the lessons learned. What did the IDD program demonstrate basically? It is the value upon the student learning when universities collaborated in teaching and learning in an authentic global context to create and sustain deep partnerships with communities worldwide. And the different beliefs and opinions amongst the students were inherently both an obstacle as well as an advantage, where students ultimately relied upon their shared language of design. And another thing was, it became increasingly aware that Anganwadi centers played a vital role in the community, strengthening the fabric of neighborhoods and helping them early learning skills, imagination, independence, and health outcomes for children. So the architecture that gives back to society. See, because in Anganwadis, it was not only the learning, it was health was also considered, because the food is being provided for the children there. And apart from the children, the pregnant mothers are also there, and they are also being given nutritious food, and the lactating mothers are also there. But when you go and see the Anganwadis, there is not enough space for all these activities. It is just one single room. And still the children, though they come from these rural communities and all, they still try to adapt. Though there is a lot that being architects, and given in those given constraints, we are able to do much more for them. But for that, we have to go to the community and we have to talk to the people, get engaged with them, and see what they want. And that is what we have been doing through IDT. Yeah. Now, the design strategies, methodologies, tools, and language are evolving due to how design professionals and others are addressing an increasing range of social, cultural, and environment challenges, which was told. And this paper, it further described the experience of the IDD community of university architecture students and faculty teaching academics engaging with Anganwadi community and with the local government. And this research method was not the primary motive in this study. However, this objective was in creating and providing a learning environment and learning experience for the students, where the real experiences and the powerful process of reflection upon learning and engagement are extremely helpful in creating knowledge for what works for specific context and a specific community with intuitive learning at play. So this is a small effort what is actually being done by a group of these academic communities from Australia, India, and Malaysia, so that we are trying to see that we can instill some understanding of cultures and the needs of humanity in future generation of architects without any borders. Because architects is, we can design huge buildings, big buildings, but I think this is somewhere where we have to give to the people, and such social outreach projects, the end users of the community, I think through our built environment, if we can give them back something, we will be doing a great service to the community. So this is where I will end my paper, and there are many more things you can see in the paper.
Thank you to the presenters, especially Usha ma'am and Rama ma'am, because they came long way just to present their papers. And here we are winding up the session. So before that, discussion will be going on, will take place. So I request moderators, Dr. Sunita ma'am, to start the discussion.
So, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers who appointed
this particular session is related to the education and which is playing a very important role. So it plays a very important role in making the environment sustainable, and we all have to play a very significant role in making the environment sustainable in terms we are not only concerned with the environment, we are also concerned with the social, economic and environmental issues as well. So here the session is open for the discussion. So during the first lecture, which was taken by the Judy Rogers, so in this particular session, we learnt about the climatic changes which are going on, especially in the Queensland, where the forest fire is, it is an outbreak there. And now from the audience, I would like to hear how this forest fire can be, means how we can resist these kind of calamities which are going on, and how we can overcome these kind of things. So anybody from the audience who would like to comment upon it? Because a lot of young people are sitting here. Some ideas should come out from those people, and we should discuss the things together.
I'm sorry, I didn't listen to the speaker. I don't know the contents of the video, but since you asked this question, I'm answering this specific question. What could you do for stopping or the issue of forest fire?
Yeah.
I happen to live inside forest, so
Okay.
that's my only qualification for talking about it. For the last 3 years, I've been living there. Ever
So
since
that
I
is your
retired
habitat.
yeah. So I know about it, and Rajaji National Park in Uttarakhand.
Okay.
And before that also I've always been interested in visiting forests and trekking inside forests and going in the mountains, and so kind of conversant with that. The forest fire, the entire, now all over the world forest fires occur, and in India also it occurs.
Yeah.
In the mountains, particularly in summertime. Summertime there are, one is natural reasons and the causes for forest fire. Another is the man-made. So it is the man-made natural causes, it occurs for a good reason. Because when forest fires occur naturally, then it also helps in regeneration in a natural way. For example, after the summer heat, the undergrowth becomes very dry. And then any rustle of this bamboo or anything,
that
there are
creates
natural
a spark,
reasons for it. Creates it. Sometimes it could be also be a thunderstorm, and then lightning striking it, and then sparking it, and then it's ideal for. So the undergrowth
That is a
is
natural
completely
cause.
organized,
That is a natural
that
cause.
doesn't damage the trees, and then it helps regeneration of the grass, which is good for the cattle later on, and also it helps the regeneration of trees like pine and all that. So that is one natural way. But when man-made things, that is because of carelessness. This is what has to be there. In the case of mountains in India, we don't have any restrictions in the entry of people into the forest. And we also know till recently there have been forest dwellers. We recognize the rights of forest dwellers. Tribal people are there, Gujars are there, Gujars are there. They have been there. They have been with great difficulty. They have been kind of relocated to the edge of the forest. Still, people keep going in and out, and then people and in the mountains, Tirthayatris and trekkers, and there anybody has the summer time comes and everybody goes to the mountains and forest, and then they go because nobody stops. Unlike the Western countries where even though trekking is allowed, going into the forest is allowed, there are strict do's and don'ts. Here we don't have any strict do. You can go anywhere. In spite of, though we have a forest guard and entire force is there, but so against this is tens of thousands of people keep going visiting, and we don't have such a strong force to stop them from doing whatever they want. It could be lighting campfire and smoking, and then burns things. So somewhere here and there they leave lighted things. And
So what are the reasons?
I said so. what could be done here is, I said the carelessness of the people who visit forest who do not have any business in the forest at all. So even there, though the forest department, it delineates a core area, inner core area, outer core area, and then where people can visit, where people cannot visit, but people take it with pride, stealthily, because nobody is stopping them, like that. They are not policemen, they don't armed guards, though they keep moving around and guarding the forest, but sometimes a lot of people, poachers also go there. A lot of people there. At the night it's a very active forest in India. So if you read about the dwindling population of leopards, for example, or any other wildlife, it is because of these poachers, and they have people are there for their own advantage. They keep doing it, and they also sometimes cost. Not why sometimes. They are also a cause for that. There is in India forests, and there is a conflict between wild animals, because forest is the habitat of the
Wild
wildlife.
animals, yeah.
So there is a conflict between wildlife and human settlements. So human settlements also sometimes what they do, it appears, both sometimes even government appears that ultimately they want to do away with the forest, because there is so much of pressure on pressure for having more of agricultural land, more land for urbanization, more land for settlement, and our population is increasing, so there is a pressure. So how do you do it? You do it in many ways. So one thing is, when forest is gone and repeatedly, and then you replace the original vegetation with eucalyptus or some other kind of a plantation kind of a thing, and every year keep copying it. So the forest in quality, though we have the government may claim that we have 20% of our country is under forest, but effectively, quality-wise, we have hardly 10% of the land is under forest.
So in
So
Uttarakhand,
there are so many issues involved in it. But to come to the forest fire, the thing is, it has to be it is more of vigilance is required, more of guarding is required, and people have to be educated to be more responsible, some kind of a thing. So it requires a kind of a massive awareness campaign. People, because I would say that if somebody is interested in visiting forests, trekking in the mountains, I think it's a welcome thing. People should visit forest and be there, camp there, but you should know what to do and what not to do, what to carry there and what not to carry there. And so many bit strict. Taking having music and then expecting something there, and having the kind of fast food there, and use of plastics and other things which kind of spoils the entire thing. It's all part of your being careless. So that has to be
that
kind of,
people should be educated for this particular thing. Anybody else from the audience? Yes, please.
Thank you, Chair Lady. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I come from a very small country, and we hardly have forests. So I'm the least important person to talk about forests. But maybe talking about concrete forests, yes, maybe I can speak about it.
Okay,
But
sir.
nevertheless, I'd like to share with Mr. Shankar. I fully agree with him that all of us must be very careful, not as an individual, but also as a corporation. Now, we are very intimately linked with Australia, and because of Singapore close relationship with Australia, then we come to know more about forests, because Australia has many forests, and Australia forests are really burning. Now, there was an incident in which a forest was burning, and later they found out the reason was due to a cable, electrical cable, that touched the ground and sparked and created a big forest fire. And that was later traced to a company which is an Australian company but was bought by Singapore. And therefore they say Singapore has set fire in Australia. So when you are as an individual and as a corporation, you have to be very careful. Even when you invest in a country, we have to be very careful to not be careful not to set any fire by making sure every part of your infrastructure is safe and sound. That's my little contribution. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Morning, everyone. I would like to highlight one of the major reasons that this occurrence is, including the Amazon fires that we have
Yeah.
witnessed, that was in the news
That
very much.
spreads from kilometers to kilometers.
Yeah,
Mm.
and one
Yes.
of the major reasons is the greenhouse effect and the global warming. That is the major contributor, because with industrialization and with everything going ahead, we are lacking behind in conserving our forests and the wildlife. So that is a major contributor to the wildlife. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you that global warming is one of the major cause which is creating this kind of catastrophe. So next is regarding the Usha ma'am's lecture. She contributed the bridging gap. She just discussed about the how to bridge the gap between the industry and the academia. So here we all, most of us are sitting here are the academicians, and I think is there anybody from the industry? Okay, so madam, I would like to ask you what. So what else? What madam? Okay, okay. Now you are free to ask. Uh, See,
It was
I have one question actually. Yeah, yeah. See, industry and academia, they should work together. But in India, it is not so. We are planning, means government is now forcing us that these two organizations should come together and they should work for the upliftment of any kind of technology or whatever. But we are not getting good response from the industry people, and that's why we are just lagging behind. So what strategy should be followed by the academic institutions so that we should be in close contact with the industry?
I don't think you're lacking behind, because I seeing the amount of research that's been going on. I think it is a feedback loop that needs to be between the industry and the academicians. I think that's what you're saying, because there is a lot of outcomes of the research which can be put into implementation. What I found was one lacking experience that I can say was the language. You know, sometimes with as being academicians, because I also teach, I find that the language that academicians use sometimes are very high tech for somebody in the industry to understand. You know, so we need to somehow simplify it. I'm not saying go the reductionist way, but simplify what we want to say to communicate that, so that people in the
That
industry,
communication gap is all, it is there.
yes, but there are also good examples where projects, where research institutes are taking part into implementation. So like you saw the Mastership project, it has a university involved in it. Even the similar thing with respect to SEP, they are also working through research as well as on-ground implementation. So there are a lot of these collaborations which will kind of help, you know.
Yeah, it is there. Now it is now, means the percentage of projects are increasing year by year, but still there is, percentage is less.
Yes, I agree with you, and I think more of such programs will obviously help. You know, such programs which require industry to look for a collaborator with a research institute to be able to then work together for larger scale programs, larger scale impact. So, I mean, I see now when even we are bidding for proposals, we see a requirement of a research institute sometimes as a part of the program, you know, when we bid for that. So we go and look for alignment with respect to other institutes when we are bidding for proposals together. So that is one way where I feel that, you know, more such programs will possibly help, because so far that was not so much, not in India, but now I think that's happening much more in India. That's I don't know if I've answered that. I wanted a question. I mean, you did a lot of research in Indonesia, and I mean, I saw the extensive work with respect to the workshops that you're looking at. What is the next step? I'm just curious. Like, you had this output. You said that these are the items that are required to be done. But where do you see it going from there? I mean, how?
Face the audience. So, just as a quick
snapshot, especially for those who were not here during my presentation. So the research involved 5 universities in 5 different countries, and we were looking at how could we look at engaging better with built environment curriculum, particularly around industry engagement and government engagement. And so your question about where to from here, particularly in the Indonesian context, the International Finance Corporation has been involved in spearheading and catalyzing green code development in Indonesia. Unfortunately, in the country, they don't have a central government that through the Ministry of Education, yes, but that Ministry of Education does not cover professional programs. So what they have done is they've brought in a green building code for Jakarta to start with. That came in about 2000 and after we left, so maybe 2017, 16, 17. And then, interestingly enough, in Bandung, the mayor of Bandung is a planning, architecture and planning graduate, and he was absolutely keen to ensure that their city followed next. So Bandung is also now brought in an energy efficiency code. And the third city, the third main city that they were looking at is Makassar. So I don't know what the status of Makassar is, but certainly an international organization like the International Finance Corporation can spearhead in the process. But I have to just sort of say this with a bit of caution as well, because people like us come in, researchers come in, they do the bit of research and then leave it to the country to take it forward, and we cannot drive this from the Australian context. It's really important that knowledge is then taken forward by they take ownership of the research and then drive that knowledge forward. I just want to make one comment in relation to the question that you asked about how this bridging the gap, and certainly there are examples of how industry engagement is taking place. But I would say again, treat it with a bit of caution, because industry works in very different time frames from academia. And certainly there has been an issue in the Australian context. Particularly when you're looking at Australian funded research by the Australian government, there are lots of such type of spark type of grant availability in the country. But industry wants to move very quickly, particularly when there's IP involved, there's patents involved. They want to commercialize that as soon as possible. And of course, they want to get a return on investment in the form of dollars or money. But in the academic context is different. In the academic context, the outputs that are desired are very much in the research space and in the publication space. And yes, there may be an IP issue there as well. But then, this is where I think the disconnect starts to happen.
Yes.
And the timelines are not aligned, unfortunately. And there needs to be more work done in that space so that the timelines, the language, the outcomes are also then aligned. Then it makes it easier on all parties. And then it doesn't become a case of, the academic institutions or the universities want to sort of get their outputs for X, Y, and Z, whereas the industry is looking at ABC and never the twain shall meet. That is a problem.
So I think that helps when you're designing programs together. Yes. And it's not like subcontracted. Yes. If it's designed together, then everybody puts their goals, their outcomes together, and you are clear in that front. Yes.
So you would like to say something?
Yes, so collaboration.
Yeah, I wanted to address one of the concerns she had regarding the timelines, because the industry works very fast and the academic sometimes. But this could have actually, we have worked on some partnerships with the TERI and also with builders, like glazing companies to manufacture.
It's audible.
So to develop some fenestration tools so that we can use it for building envelope optimization. So some of this has really worked for the benefit of the students. And also this academic industry interface can really work very well with respect to making students more employable immediately after graduation. Because some of the gaps we have seen is they take some couple of years to get them trained. So that thing about assimilating them into the mainstream profession becomes very much more streamlined. So I think that is a gap that can be addressed with this. And again, the smart cities would have been a great project for this academic industry interface, because again, timelines was not a concern there, because still we could have, we worked with Bangalore City's Smart City Council, and somehow then there was a special purpose vehicle for that, and somehow that did not take off the SPVs or neither the proposals, and again different lobbies, there was a certain concerns regarding that. But a lot of these smart city projects could have been a great platform for this academic industry interface. And again, another thing is the government should support more with respect to incentives. So normally some of these, the government expects the industry to put an equal amount into what government is putting in Indian context. So they should also give some incentives for both them to work together. I think that is some of these things they have to address. That's all. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Just to add to what Pradeep is saying, we have done certain things like this, certain projects, sustainable development projects, which we initiated in Shivamogga and all. And the government comes forward, and then after doing everything, the students take it up as an academic project, and they're doing it. And after that, it just goes.
Huh. Nobody is ready to take it forward. Huh.
Yeah, nobody owns it. And academics also, after that semester, it is there. Even now we can take it and do something, but nobody comes forward. And even if you see this IDID, we are doing it only academically. But there also, if we try to have some industry into it, I think we can do wonders.
This looks
Exactly.
like your presentation about everybody working together in a holistic way. That would address
That is actually required. That is actually required.
Ma'am, actually, I also wanted to ask you a question. Specifically, the example you gave of Indonesia's Islamic vernacular elements. So, do you see that as a limitation to generalize the field, or do you see as an advantage in that, for that matter?
You mean in terms of reviving the architecture into?
Like you said, like this is the limiting factor in Islamic architecture when it comes to generalization. But do you see that otherwise?
I don't think I said that. What I said, yeah, what I said was that, and now that Dr. Liu is here, I will say, the Singaporean architects are going into Indonesia and taking over the role and the jobs of the local architects as a result of ASEAN. That was one of the findings of our research. So, so what I was saying basically is that the local elements, the architectural elements, and the indigenous elements, that is a result of so many years of growth and development in the country, that is being suppressed because the architects coming in from outside that are bringing their influence into the country. And there isn't enough confidence and enough recognition and awareness of the local architecture that is now being subjugated. That's what I was saying. So I'm not saying that it's good or bad in terms of the influence of the architecture. That's for the Indonesian people to decide. I mean, who am I to come in and judge what the response, architectural response ought to be? That's for people to decide. But in terms of generally speaking, if you're not allowing local responses, understanding the local context and place better than somebody who comes in from the outside, then you're doing the people a disservice. And I don't think that's fair on the Indonesian people.
Yes.
It is very common in many countries, including Singapore, where our professionals, including our architects, also feel that they are deprived of being doing the projects within their country. So Singaporeans also face the same thing, because we have a lot of foreign professionals, architects, very good architects. They come over to Singapore and they build all the tall buildings for Singapore. So much so that our own professionals, our own architects have to go to other countries to share whatever. And by doing that, of course, there will be sometimes elbowing and so on and so forth. So we share, and the whole world is like that. So we understand that. Thank you.
Ma'am, you would like to say something?
I am picking up on one statement that Usha madam had made about faculty, somebody from the academics, when they are taking up a project on the side or when they have a practice on the side, where they are not able to give 100% dedication to their academic activities. I am from academics and I had a practice before and I wound it up because I simply couldn't find time. But if we look back at, I'm from a government college also, so to have a practice on the side is illegal. We are not allowed to practice. But there is this general comment that we usually hear that a teacher who doesn't practice cannot teach, because he or she has to have that industry exposure, he or she has to be updated all the time, so that we are equipping the students to go out and start practicing from day one. So how would you address that? Like, this is not a question, this is a comment, because I agree with what you said, but it is constantly critiqued in India, that if you do not practice, then how can you teach?
Do you have to be in a university 24/7? Do you have to be in a university 24/7 to not understand what is happening in industry? I mean, industry engagement does not mean you have to have a practice, because, as you said, rightly said, it is not physically possible for a person to be engaged 100% in academia if you're meeting all your academic KPIs, that is, and also run a successful practice. It's just not possible. And you've also mentioned the word illegal. Now that's opening another basket of issues. But there are different ways you can still influence and bring in that industry knowledge and experience into the classroom. So I think you answered the question yourself, because you said you have to have industry experience. So I actually think it's a good thing to have, particularly now when you're talking about the architecture profession, as well as to some extent even in the engineering profession. It is very good if people go out after the graduation, to go out into the industry, work for 5 or 10 years in the industry, and then come back into the academic and retain those industry connections, because that is important. There's no point in having that industry experience if that industry experience is only limited to 10 years and you're not able to continue to have that engagement with the industry. I think that is really important. So rather than having somebody, and it happens in Australia, I can tell you it happens in Australia and it happens in other parts of the world, where somebody will do an undergraduate degree, particularly in the built environment area, do a master's immediately after 2 years, and then enroll for a PhD, and is only understanding research. I mean, built environment profession is an applied research profession, and you need to have the industry engagement and connection. While research continues, yes, but it's all applied research. You're not grounding research, and you're not bringing in theoretical information into the research process. So I'm very much of the school that says, yes, go out into the industry, get some experience and come back, but maintain those industry connections, because you also then have a better understanding of the disconnect that is taking place between academia and industry as well.
Okay, now I would like to hear from the students. What are your expectations from the industry? From the student? No. So they all are satisfied with the industry?
Actually, the students, in India, we have, it's a 5-year program. And recently, it was a 1-year internship we had. Now again, council has reduced it to 6 months. So in this 1-year program, when the students go from 4th year, when they apply, all the architects outside are asking, they're not willing to take them, because they say that we need almost 6 months to train them. So there is a huge gap. Of course, we have faculty with industry experience, and they share their experiences, and we have visiting faculty who come and teach the students, because in all our design subjects, we have one faculty will be from the industry. But in spite of all this, they are still asking. So they do not get into some good firms also. So where exactly the students are losing, and how should we really bring this industry into academics, in terms of giving them that practical knowledge? And the students, when they come back also, they tell us that after they work in the industry for 1 year or so, then they have learned what they've not learned in those 5 years. So I think this is something we have to look into it very seriously.
That's a different experience, so obviously it will be,
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is when they go, yeah, that is the actual scenario. So I'm trying to see that before we send them into the internship, no, why don't we train them so that they can be ready to go into the industry?
What
And
is stopping? I mean, as an architecture student many years ago in India, I used to work part time.
yeah, actually, even I was working.
Stopping students from doing that?
No, that is because in some of the college, no, that is okay. No, in some of the colleges they have from 9 to 5. The college is from 9 to 5. In some of the cities, they have in the morning from 8 to 2 or things like that. So in such cases, they go and work. And I think the curriculum has to be designed in such a way because yeah,
We need to relook at how our curriculum
yes, exactly.
Even if I look at it, ours is not a typical architecture practice, but I can't even give internships to architecture students because they need typical working drawings. I can't engage them in research projects because the COA asks them for working drawings. So it needs a systemic shift basically across even the way our curricula are designed so that we can engage because we want interns. I mean, there are only very few colleges which allow us to look at internships even at the BArch level, if not.
No, I think we can address these things to see how we can train the students immediately before they were especially in India because after 5 years, at 4 years they go into the industry. At least abroad, they do the 3 years and then 2 years masters, and then they again work in the industry and then they get their registration.
I realize that at least at the BArch level, the topics about sustainable environment, built environments, they're not.
No, they're not. Because I looked at the requirements of the curriculum here in India, and it's no different from it is in Indonesia or anywhere else, or Sri Lanka or anywhere else, because it's all about the basic. And I think this is the biggest problem. And I'm not suggesting that technical aspects are not important, but most of the courses tend to focus on the technical aspects. They don't focus on the overall rounding of the course across, or the program across a number of different skills. There's the technical capacity that the industry is looking for, but then the technical capacity needs to come with some of the softer skills and life skills as well, which I think needs to be it requires more discussions and debate and getting the industry to sit down. So the point that you made about they saying we can't employ them, but why not? Yeah. What is it that they're lacking that we can try and reflect back into some of the post-learning outcomes to the academic setting? Right.
Sorry
you,
to
ma'am.
interrupt, but we have to
So,
wind up the session.
Yes, we have short of time.
So first of all, I would like to thank you, Judy Rogers ma'am, who has taken time. And on behalf of her, I request Dr. Usha ma'am to take her mementos. So please, I request Dr. Sunita ma'am to give her the mementos on behalf of Judy Rogers. I would like to announce one thing. For the trip on the third day, that is 21st December, those who are interested, I request them to give the names to the registration team so that we can decide the number of candidates. For poster presentation, the candidates are requested to reach the architecture department after lunch or during lunch, and the rest of the next 2 sessions will be, their posters will be displayed there. For the best poster and the best paper, in the evening after, for the thank you note, we will announce the candidates for the best poster and the best paper. So I request all of you to go for the tea break in the conference hall. And thank you. We will come back for the session of Kailashi Shankar sir, who has just arrived. I welcome you, sir. Thank you. Please come back in 10 minutes.